Good afternoon. In this webinar, we're talking about the advocacy work that happens at the state and national peak bodies for volunteering. The discussion covers the importance of advocacy at a state and national level, particularly after a large year of bushfires and COVID-19, and the current national and state advocacy priorities and how the advocacy sausage is made. So before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land which we call Australia. I'm coming to you from the people of the traditional Kulin Nations land, and I'd like to extend my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd invite all of you to acknowledge, I know many of us are coming from different parts of Victoria, so I'd encourage you all to acknowledge the traditional custodians where you are via the chat function. So just a few housekeeping notes before I introduce our two guests. You should have arrived on mute throughout the webinar, and please stay this way throughout the entirety of the webinar. There's a public chat box that you can use to send messages or hellos to other participants. And please feel free to type any questions you might have for our two presenters, and we'll raise it with them at the end of the webinar. After this webinar is done, this webinar will be available for viewing on the Volunteering Victoria website. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my two guests, Sue Regan and Jillian Garner. So Dr. Sue Regan joined Volunteering Australia in February 2020. Sue is also a lecturer at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Formerly, Sue was a program director at the Institute of Public Administration Australia, the ACT division, and a program lead social policy at HC Coombs Policy Forum. Prior to her move to Australia in 2010, Sue undertook roles in not-for-profit, think tank and government sectors in the UK, specialising in social policy. This included as Chief Executive Officer of the Resolution Foundation, Associate Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research and Policy Director of Shelter. Sue has a Master's in Economics and a PhD in Public Policy. As the Policy Director at Volunteering Australia, Sue is responsible for research, policy development and advocacy. And let me introduce Jillian Garner. So Jillian joined Volunteering Victoria as Business and Policy Officer in January 2020. She has over 20 years experience in law, the not-for-profit sector and the international development field, having worked in the Australasia, Asia, Pacific region and in Southern Africa. Jillian worked as a development lawyer in South Africa prior to moving to Australia with her family in 1999. In Australia, she worked in project management with an international development organisation in Melbourne until 2011. Before joining Volunteering Victoria, Jillian was the Executive Officer for the Victorian Council of Civil Liberties, Liberty Victoria, a not-for-profit organisation which has a long history of working to defend and extend human rights and freedoms in Victoria. So welcome, Sue and Jillian. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Sarah. Good to be here.
Nice to have you. So I'm going to ask you both to tell us, as we always start off our webinars before we get into today's topic, a little bit about yourself and your role. And so I'll start with you, Jillian, although I believe most people here would be familiar with Volunteering Victoria. If you want to talk a little bit about yourself and what you do for VV, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm, as Sarah said, I'm Business and Policy Officer. So while I deal with advocacy and policy, I am also responsible for membership at VV, and also help with the sort of administration of the CPD program, which Sarah manages, and some aspects of the business of Volunteering Victoria. One of a couple who take calls and inquiries from the public and from members. So it gives me quite a good overview of what's happening in Victoria. That's pretty useful, I find, because we at least know what the issues are out there in the volunteering space. And as you probably know, we cannot really advocate on stuff if we don't know what's going on. There are a couple of us at Volunteering Victoria who deal with different aspects of advocacy and policy work, but we do work very closely together. when I first started at VV, I worked on a state government submission, 2021. But then last year, probably primarily because of COVID and the number of issues that came out of that, I focus more on operational policy issues. And in my role, I sit in on a policy network meeting, which is organised, as Sue will tell you, through Volunteering Australia, and where we share ideas between the different state peaks and with Volunteering Australia. So that's it.
Fantastic, Jillian. And Sue, did you want to give a little bit of an introduction to yourself and to Volunteering Australia? Though again, unlike our regular webinars, I really hope most of the people who are online know about both VV and VA.
Yeah, so I'm Policy Director at Volunteering Australia. So that means I look after all our research, our policy development work and our advocacy. I have a team of volunteer researchers that helps me with that. I mean, I'm fairly new to Volunteering Australia, so I joined last February, but I've worked in a range of social policy organisations, both here and in the UK, and also worked in government as well as the voluntary sector. Yeah, and it's so we deal with national advocacy priorities. I also oversee the CPD program, which of course was started in Volunteering Victoria, but is now a national program. Yeah, so that's me.
Fantastic. And so while you guys, your primary role isn't necessarily volunteer management, I do always like to ask people who come onto these webinars how they got involved in volunteering and volunteer management, because I think it's safe to say that the common story is people found it and discovered it. So I guess, Sue, how did you get involved in the volunteering sector?
Yeah, so, I'm a lifelong volunteer myself, but really, in terms of a work and sort of professional capacity, I got involved really through my sort of social policy work and realising how important volunteers are to, achieving the kind of well-being of society and, a lot of the social policy priorities that we have. So, and so when the opportunity came to work at Volunteering Australia, it seemed a really good fit for me. And I'm one of the first things I did in coming to Volunteering Australia was to develop our own volunteer program, so that we get the amazing expertise of volunteer researchers from around the country.
Fantastic, and that's so great. Jillian, do you want to talk a little bit about how you ended up in the volunteering space?
Yeah, I think for me, mine's probably a little bit different just in terms of my background. Because I have been involved, I was a development lawyer in South Africa, and then when I moved to Australia 20 years ago now, I worked in the development sort of sector. But within development, you always work with communities. And for me, I have a particular interest in human rights. So it's about the human part of individuals and what's going on. So that's always been a particular interest for me. And that, to me, kind of was a natural sort of segue into volunteers and the volunteer sector, because it's about providing support that empowers and enables communities to get on and do what they need to do. So it was in some ways just a natural fit for me. So when I finished up at Liberty Victoria and try to work out what I wanted to do, this was a particular interest. So and I mean, in a lot of the roles that I've been in, we have had a lot of volunteers involved. So yeah, so I think it's just a community development kind of background that's led me into it.
Fantastic. So when Jillian and Sue and I met to sort of flesh out this particular webinar, and, you know, fleshing out how we would talk about the advocacy efforts at a state and a national level, we thought it was important to really, I guess, touch on what advocacy actually is in the volunteer sector and what it looks like. And so, Sue, I might go to you first, if that's all right, given you lead our national efforts.
Yeah. Yeah, and so you referred to our conversation prior to this webinar, and I think I talked about how so you mentioned in the introduction that I teach public policy at the ANU, you know, and in the course that I teach, which is a Masters of Public Policy, we spend the first kind of 6 hours, sort of the first 2 weeks really just talking about this question: what is public policy and what is advocacy? So, you know, and we haven't got
so
that
you're
long
suggesting
today.
we're trying to do it in too short a time frame, Sue?
Well, possibly, but you know what? I think it is really about, you know, as you know, it says in the slides that, you know, it's really, when it comes to advocacy, it's about representing the views of a group to the people who influence and make decisions in relation to public policy. You know, so we're representing those views to bring about positive change. And so, I mean, we'll come on and talk about examples, but really it's about, you know, listening to the needs of a particular group, which of course in our case is volunteers, volunteer managers and the broader sector, and trying to represent those views to government and other key decision makers. So that's it in a nutshell, I think. But there's, you know, if you Google policy advocacy or public policy, you come up with 1,000 different perspectives on what it means.
Fair enough. So Jillian, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
No, I think Sue's covered most of it, but I think for me, it's just a lot of words. It's like words like speaking out and promoting, shining a light, saying that you are doing something for or by or on behalf of. So those are kind of the words that spell it out for me. And as Sue says, it's about making things better, changing things with positive changes. And it could be an issue or it could be an area of importance for the sector. But to me, it's also about empowering the people that we are representing to give them a way of advocating on their behalf, because volunteers are advocates for volunteering. So it's giving them the tools so that they can also speak out about how things are impacting them.
Fantastic. And I guess I'll throw it back to you, Jillian, I guess around just like, if you could flesh out for those that are online today, I guess what that looks like from volunteering peak bodies, whether that is, you know, what forms that takes. Is it having meetings? Is it, you know, you've mentioned a budget submission that you worked on at the start. If you could kind of expand on that, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I think, why does one advocate? It's really because either others can't, or perhaps one has more influence or more power, or perhaps an overview of a sector, or able to research issues and take them forward. And the point is that if we all work together, we are so much stronger and our voice is so much louder. But it does require listening and hearing, as Sue says. And for Volunteering Victoria, I mean, our goal is for strong, resilient, and a respected sector that works effectively. And we want it to be taken seriously, and we want it to be recognised and show what its value is. So within our role at VV as the peak body is about taking that sector and shining a light on it and pushing forward certain important issues or concerns or things that we think are really relevant to the sector. And it can mean a number of things. It can be finding funding for the sector. It might be finding funding for a particular element, doing training of volunteer managers in a particular area. But it's not only about funding. It might also be changing laws or changing policies, or maybe a media release. Maybe it's about getting the public to understand more about volunteering generally or just part of volunteering. So there's a very broad spread because each issue may have a different way of taking it forward.
Fantastic. And Sue, was there anything you wanted to add in terms of how this looks from a VA perspective?
Yeah, I mean, Jillian's covered, the key points that I see it really as, getting that, you can't advocate on behalf of people if you don't understand the views and needs of that group. So, a very important part of our advocacy work is to get that input, and we do it, directly through surveys and consultations with the sector. But as Jillian mentioned, we have a policy group where the state and territory peak volunteering organisations and Volunteering Australia come together, and we share our knowledge and experience and discuss advocacy and policy priorities. And so it's about getting that input. It's then about engaging in processes, and that might be a budget process, it might be a government consultation, it might be a royal commission, might be a parliamentary inquiry. So we engage in that in that process and try and influence people throughout that process. And I would just add, so in some ways, the most important bit isn't the document that you produce, which is a submission to a process, which, I mean, that's important, and we might talk about it more, but it's actually about developing strong and ongoing relationships so that when those opportunities to influence do come up, that you have that existing relationship and you're far more effective. So there's some of the things that our jobs involve. And
Sarah, can I just add one other part, is that it is also really important that our sector and the people who we are representing are aware of what we're doing and informed, and so that they can also use that information or those tools in their day-to-day activities, which also then just carry forward that issue. So it's just an important part of that. As Sue says, just the document itself is not alone, it might help a little bit, but it's not going to do everything. There's a whole lot of stuff that has to happen around it.
Absolutely, and I think it's a vital point, and one of the reasons I asked you guys to both participate in today's webinar. But certainly that maintaining of relationships, you want to be, I guess, that go-to for government to come and ask when they're considering changes in direction, funding, etc. So Sue, I'll now put you on the spot and ask you what the current national priorities are.
Yeah, so aren't priorities always difficult, because there's always too many priorities for the capacity that you have. But I would say that the kind of big ones for Volunteering Australia at the moment, and really informed by what's going on around the country, is the first one is still around the impact of COVID, and in particular advocating to support the reinvigoration of volunteering. So that's a kind of ongoing priority for us. And just because 2020 ended, that did not mean this wasn't still a really big advocacy priority for us. The second is around the role of volunteers in some key sectors, and in particular aged care and disability care. And that's partly because there's some kind of big processes of reform that are going on at the moment where there are opportunities to influence, and which is the Royal Commission on Aged Care and other big reform processes going on in disability care. And then the third one I was just going to flag, which is a kind of an ongoing burning priority, which is of course about money. So we put a lot of effort into influencing the federal budget, and which is about making sure that current funds that go to the volunteering sector are protected, but also trying to encourage greater investment to support volunteering. And one of our priorities is around funding to develop a national volunteering strategy, so that we can have a more strategic approach to volunteering across the country. So yeah, there's some of the big national priorities at the moment. I could do another 4 or 5, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, you've been nice and restrained, so thank you, Sue. And I'd certainly point people out to the recent research that VA has, published around returning volunteers and reinvigorating the sector post-COVID-19, as well as I know Mark has been recently talking to Pro Bono Australia about the importance of the national volunteering strategy. So definitely worth a Google, those two. So Jillian, do you want to talk to us a little bit about some of the state priorities that we're looking at from a VV perspective?
Yeah, so clearly the COVID responses have been a major part of the work that we've been doing, and it continues. There's still a number of issues that have come out of that, and they are a particular focus and priority for us to keep an eye on them and to continue to see what we can add and help the sector in terms of coming out of COVID at this point. But then, of course, it's the Victorian Volunteer Strategy. So we are keeping a very good and close eye and are quite involved with the strategy, which is has been underway for a while. We take part in some of the regional fora, which have been really good. And then, of course, the volunteer management activity, so VMA, is clearly a big focus for us at the moment. And that's causing, it's a lot of angst within our community, and so there's a lot of work going into that. And then recent work we've done is the LGBTIQ plus inclusive volunteering submission that we made, and there's some parliamentary advocacy that's going on where we're just really trying to build up our networks or strengthen our networks, so where we already have contacts and making new contacts and just making sure those remain current. And then there are a number of ongoing ones. There's the facilitating capability and development pathways and recognition for volunteer leaders, so through leaders and managers through CPD. And then there's Volpol and the State of Volunteering report, which was done last year, which were particular highlights, and there'll be a lot that comes out of that. So they remain a focus for us and a priority too.
Absolutely, and certainly the State of Volunteering report is one of those really important advocacy tools that we didn't have prior to last year, and so that's a great way of attracting attention when talking and developing relationships on advocacy. So now to talk about the big elephant in the room, or the thing that we're all so sick of talking about, the big COVID factor. So I guess, Sue, how did responding to COVID-19 kind of change your priorities or change the priorities for VA last year?
Yeah, so, as I think people all around the globe, it did radically change our priorities. I think, first of all, I think what we identified as being important was to make sure that we understood how volunteering was being affected by COVID. And, that wasn't something that was kind of very evident first up. So we commissioned some research to try and get a good sense of the different ways in which volunteering was being affected by COVID and the extent to which volunteering was being affected. So that's something that we prioritized all along. I think if you don't have information, it's hard to advocate. So that's been an ongoing priority, is to make sure that, both through hearing the stories of people on the ground, but also having, good statistical analysis of what's happening across the country in terms of the impact of COVID. So that became one of our research priorities, which wasn't obviously anywhere on the list at the beginning of 2020. And then we've really had to put a lot of effort into advocating on a range of COVID-related issues. Right from, we've worked very hard to try and make sure that the federal government includes volunteers in all their communications. So, initially much of what that came out of the Department of Health just talked about employers and employees. There was very little about volunteers. We've done work around the pandemic insurance gap. So this issue that volunteers aren't protected for illnesses under volunteer insurance, so are not, not valid under COVID. And we've also been working hard to try and get extra resources and funding to support volunteering to recover from COVID. So, the supplementary volunteer grants round was that appeared towards the end of last year was, part of that was trying to get the federal government to recognise that, that the sector needed help. And something that Jillian and I have been talking about in the last couple of weeks is how volunteers are being treated in the vaccination, the COVID-19 vaccination rollout. And again, advocating for we've been advocating for their inclusion in the early stages of the vaccination rollout, if the roles are frontline and essential worker positions in particular. So it was a big shift in our priorities. And they're just some of the examples of things we've been doing.
Well, absolutely. And a lot of the kind of commentary that we've certainly been finding is that COVID-19 really exacerbated some existing gaps in the sector. So, things that were maybe, priorities, but lower priorities became such a bigger concern as we were responding to COVID-19. Jillian, did you want to talk about the work we did at the Statebased?
Yeah, I think Sue's probably covered off in a lot because, it was happening sort of at a state level, and then we fed into a process at a national level. And we were, I think, very fortunate because we were all able to share resources and information that was coming through from the various states. And we had access to Volunteering Australia, who was able to do a whole lot of research, and were advocating at a national level. And then at a state level, we just were inundated with calls coming through with organizations saying, well, can we continue or not? And how do we deal with this? And so there was a lot of that information that was fed into the processes that were going on, making sure that the resources were up to date. I think that a lot of the people that we work with were able to get information off our website, which perhaps they felt they couldn't really get enough information off the Department of Health's website, or the state or the federal government's website too. So we responded and reacted to different situations that were coming through as restrictions happened. And of course, in Victoria, we were harder hit because we had such a long period of an extreme lockdown. But again, it was very useful for me to be able to sit in the network meeting and talk to my colleagues and at least feel that they had our back too. And we were all, we were, as much as Victoria was going through it in some ways alone, we did have some backup, which was really useful. And look, we had other good networks too. We worked very closely with Justice Connect and with BCOS. And that just enabled us to respond, I think, fairly effectively. But we were listening to what was happening on the ground and trying to respond to that, and just maybe just talking through issues with people too. And then that feeds into the advocacy as to how we can take it further. And that we work very, very closely with state government. Sarah, she can confirm, if there were issues that were coming through me, they'd be fed into Sarah. Sarah would talk to the Department of Health and say, we need to change the messaging on our site because it's not clear enough. So a lot of effort went into dealing with those kind of issues that popped up.
Absolutely. And that, in some ways came down to that clarity of language issue that you mentioned,
Yep.
Sue, obviously around employers. But now we're going to talk about wins, because celebrating wins is super important. Oh, So Jillian, I'll throw back to you. Can you tell us a bit about a recent win that you have had or we have had in terms of statewide advocacy?
Yeah, well, I think the NDIS worker screening check is a really recent and a really good one. And really what would have happened, just so it gives it a bit of context, at the end of last year, the new Worker Screening Act came into being, but then they started putting all the regulations in place. And the way it worked was that at a state level, the states could decide how the process of the screening would happen within the broader, bigger NDIS Commonwealth system. So each state would decide how it wanted to deal with it. We then discovered that at a state level, our volunteers were going to be treated just like workers, and they would be charged this fee of $120. So there was an assumption that volunteers, it was okay just to deal with them exactly like workers. So we did a lot of research, calling people, using networks, getting proper information on how it would impact volunteers, and then through a submission, but then also ongoing conversations with the Department of Justice, fed that information through, and they took on board what we were saying, which was that this is a real barrier to volunteering, and it just should not happen, and they needed to change their system, which they did. And so now we have a waiver, and okay, in terms of process, it's probably a little bit cumbersome, but we still have an input into that. So I keep feeding through information to the department, just saying, look, this is a little bit taking too long, it's a bit tedious, can we try and streamline it? But to us, we feel this was a real win, because quite frankly, they just did not know that this issue existed. And so once we were able to show them how this would be a real barrier and what a huge, immense problem this would be if you didn't have volunteers within the NDIS sector, which is effectively what would happen, well, that was a ridiculous situation. So yes, so for us, we are very happy with how it's turned out. And now we're just watching the process, and we'll continue to feed into it.
Absolutely, and I think it's worthwhile noting that obviously, you know, the state of volunteering and some of the evidence around barriers and fees when it comes cost to volunteers in terms of volunteering was such a vital part in the piece of that puzzle in being able to successfully prosecute that argument.
Absolutely, yeah.
So Sue, did you want to talk to us about a recent change or recent win that VA has been celebrating?
Yes, but just to kind of add to Jillian's story, what was also great about the NDIS worker screening check was, well, you know, how tenacious you were about making sure that, you know, you got a positive outcome in Victoria, but also how you engaged the other states and territories, because this was something that was happening, you know, across Australia. And so we've, you know, it's been a process where we've been able to, you know, Jillian shared that the progress that you've made at Victoria, and, you know, and those conversations are happening across the country now. So that was, yeah, that in itself is a win as well. But I was just going to talk about the supplementary volunteer grant scheme, because it, you know, really has stayed with me, this sort of advocacy experience on this, because when I joined Volunteering Australia about this time last year, one of the very first things I worked on was the volunteer grant scheme, because we were getting lots of questions about the way it was being administered, and lots of concern from the sector, from, you know, individual volunteers, but also volunteer managers and others, because the government had changed the approach, and they were administering it through members of parliament. So you had to go to your local constituent MP, and they had to put you forward in terms of proposing you as a potential recipient of a volunteer grant scheme. And we were hearing that, you know, lots of people didn't want to go to their MP, they couldn't get through to their local MP, they didn't think their local MP would be approachable, or you know, or might be ideologically of a different viewpoint to them. So there was lots. So we did some work where we put out a a position statement saying, you know, these are the concerns that are coming from the sector, please will, you know, it should be reviewed as a process. And we engaged the Federal Department of Social Services on that. And, you know, and what happened was two things really. One, COVID hit, and we argued that there needed to be extra funding. So they decided to initiate a supplementary volunteer grant scheme. So some additional money for the sector. But the other big change was that it was not to be administered via members of parliament, but administered by the state and territory peak volunteering bodies. So as many of you will know, Volunteering Victoria ran the supplementary volunteer grants in Victoria. And I just think that was just such a, you know, big positive outcome really for the sector, both in, you know, in getting some new money when it was needed, but also that it was administered, you know, through organisations that, the peak bodies that really understood volunteering in their communities. Yeah, so that's the one I was going to talk about. There's lots of, I mean, wins can be big or small. One that we have a whiteboard here in the office, which says, I'm looking at it now, it says wins for the week. And one that I put up a couple of weeks ago was a sort of, seems like a small win, but throughout COVID, we have been arguing that the government should be collecting official statistics on how volunteering is being affected. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics quickly put together this new survey at the beginning of COVID, which was the COVID Household Impact Survey. But they didn't include volunteering. So I've been, you know, they might kind of going back to them saying you really do need to include volunteering if you want to get a good picture on what is really happening out there in the community. Anyway, they eventually included it in the December round of that survey and published it in February. So that was sort of a little win, but it's significant because at least, you know, we now have some official statistics coming from the government on the impact of volunteering. You can tell I'm a bit of a data geek. I'm sorry, that was one of my wins.
No, I think it's a phenomenal win. And I do think it is actually really, really good to highlight how big or how small, you know, that wins can be of different sizes. Because I think sometimes we can get a bit disgruntled if we don't get a significant amount of shiny new money or a law change. But sometimes it can be the development of a relationship. I mean, just as we were logging on to test the tech for this, you were talking to me that, you know, you'd sent around some research to ministers, to MPs, talking about the impact of COVID on volunteering and expected a certain number of responses and almost quadrupled that.
Yes, yeah. No, you're right, Sarah. It is, you know, and it's all about those kind of incremental wins as well, often, that, you know, ultimately build up over time to what, you know, what we're all aiming for, which is more, you know, fundamental recognition of volunteering. So yeah, I think it is good to celebrate the little wins too.
Fantastic. And so just a reminder, if you have any questions for our panelists about some of the priorities, some of the processes, feel free to pop them in the chat now, because we only have a few more kind of planned questions to go. I just wanted to talk, or get you guys to talk a little bit about how you guys, I guess, work. And you've spoken a little bit about how you work together and with the other state peaks through that kind of policy group, you know, both formally and informally. But I wondered if you'd be happy to kind of go through the process of putting together an issue submission or a funding submission. And Jillian, I'll go to you first, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. So I guess it depends a little bit on where it comes from. Quite often there may be a government inquiry, or the government will put out a request, I guess, or a call for submissions on particular topics. A little bit like the LGBTIQ plus one that we did. So we would look at something like that and decide whether there is whether and what sort of impact there would be on the sort of volunteering sector and whether we should be making a submission. So that's a sort of fairly formal kind of process where you go through it, you research it, you put the information together. There's a lot of talking that goes on within Volunteering Victoria between the various people who work here, doing different things and sharing ideas. And then there'd be a formal submission of that. But part of it is also just deciding that there's a particular topic or a particular issue that needs to be carried forward. And that might be a more targeted process where it is about how do you frame the submission itself based on the information that we've got. And as Sarah says, something like the State of Volunteering report gives us a lot of backup information which can go into most of these submissions because it shows the value of volunteering. So if you can lead from that position, it's saying we have value. Now look at how this impacts our sector and what should be done on it. So sometimes we might be asking for funding, but it wouldn't necessarily just be asking for funding. Sometimes it's about maybe changing laws, a bit like the NDIS process. So there it was about saying, look at your policy and look at what impact this has on volunteering. And we need to make some changes here. And we've made positive suggestions and proposals on how it could be done. So they're various, they come from various aspects. I mean, there's a standard submission into the state funding or the state budget each year, which is, as Sue was saying, it happens at a federal level and then at a state level. I mean, Volunteering Victoria does have to continue to say we have a role, this is what our role is and we need funding, and that happens on a continuous basis. So that's a big exercise in itself, but then there are all these other little opportunities to put in submissions around that.
Fantastic. And Sue, did you want to talk about the process at a national level or how you guys work at VA? I know it's always a little different.
Yeah, so I think we're very reliant on the state and territory peaks for bringing the knowledge from your jurisdictions to inform the submissions that we do at a national level. I do a lot of kind of synthesis of conversations that I have with Jillian and others throughout the network, trying to make sure that when we do a national submission, that it represents what's happening across the country. So it's really fundamental to it is a process of consultation and engagement, but then there is the drafting of a document and circulating that and getting comments from people to make sure that it represents what people think are the priorities and what we should be doing about it. So all the submissions that we do at a national level are endorsed by all the state and territory peak organisations, and I think that just makes them so much stronger than if it was just Volunteering Australia. And I suppose the other bit that I thought would be interesting to mention is just that when we advocate for a particular issue, whether it's more funding or a change in a law or an inclusion in a strategy that's being developed, like the National Disability Strategy at the moment, I do a lot of testing the waters with people in government as well, because and it's a tricky balance to get, but I think we should be advocating for changes where there's a chance that it will come about. So we don't, we have to be, realistic, but also ambitious in what we, get that balance right between being realistic and being ambitious about what we want for the sector. So there's not a lot of point, I think, in putting a budget submission in saying, we want an extra $10 billion for volunteer grants in the next year, when, at the moment it's $10 million that we get. So there's so I do a sort of a process of trying to test the waters a bit on what might be achievable. But I think that in a way is the most difficult bit I find of advocacy, about, you know, not underselling what we think is needed, but also trying to put forward things which stand a chance of getting up, at least in the, you know, medium term.
Absolutely. It's a bit of a delicate balance, isn't it?
It is, yeah, it is. But I think, again, going back to, you know, and something that I've increasingly realized over the years is also having some of those conversations early, particularly in relation to the budget process. That, you know, we're always given a deadline for when budget submissions need to be in, but, you know, I've realized now that if you get it in the day of when the budget submission closes, you've missed your opportunity to influence. Really, you need to be having those conversations really throughout the year, and the actual, you know, submission is formally putting those views across. Whereas, you know, that when it really matters is earlier on in the process, having those conversations, which I think, you know, I think in the volunteering sector we're actually pretty good at doing. Yeah.
Fantastic. And so I guess we've talked a little bit about it, but I guess I'll ask both of you whether there's anything else that you want to add about how you really seek input from members. So Jillian, did you want to just talk about how we try and talk to our membership about various advocacy priorities? We've, you know, I think developing how well we do that, and we've now got an advocacy page, which is pretty active and up to date. But Jillian, I'll let you.
And it's a really important part, is that your members and the sector know what we are doing, and just touching on what Sue had said about, you know, whether you think your submission has a likelihood of succeeding. There's sort of two parts to it. You shouldn't maybe just making a submission for the sake of making a submission, but on the other hand, it's important that as a state peak we are seen to be getting involved in these issues and making statements on these very critical aspects. They may not always be listened to or followed up on, but it's really important that we make sure that voice goes in somehow. And so for us, it's to make sure that we are hearing from the people that are impacted and feeding that through. We obviously put out a lot of the newsletters that go out. There's a lot on our website that provides a lot of information. And as Sarah said, we've developed a sort of advocacy page, which we are hoping with time will become more of an interactive process where people will go on, see what we're doing, and will have an opportunity to provide feedback saying, well, couldn't we do some more work on this? Or this really does impact us. Here's some more information which might add to the discussion. And one of the things that we are looking at, which I think I will be leading this year, is to have set up another special interest group, which will have a focus on advocacy itself, looking at how we should be doing it, how could we do it better, to inspire us in a way as to what might be effective advocacy. Because, you know, we can stand and all just say how important volunteers are and how important the volunteering sector is, but often one has to actually strategize around it, because otherwise you just don't really get that impact. So we can learn perhaps from other sectors as to how they do things, what works, what doesn't work, and at the various levels, whether it's federal or state, because it might be very different in terms of how that happens. And also at a sort of local government level, there's a whole lot of stuff that could perhaps happen at a local level. And so it is also then about making sure that your volunteering organizations are able to take up issues within their areas that impact them. So you empower them to be able to speak out and give them the right tools and information to allow them to take issues forward too. So yeah, and when, look, obviously we do surveys, we have an amazing network. And so we can feed into that very directly. So with the NDIS, I could call up organizations that I knew were involved and say, how does this impact you, and get that direct feedback. And then, of course, the network that we have with VA and then with the other states has been just so valuable, particularly in terms of our COVID responses, where we all work together and shared resources and who does what, and we feed into that. So that has benefited all of us.
Fantastic. Sue, was there anything you wanted to add? I mean, obviously your membership of the state and territory peaks primarily.
Yeah, so, and you're right, we, as I said earlier, we rely on the state and territory peaks to get that input, and they really are, you know, I'd say we've kind of have a very good culture of collaboration in relation to our policy work. I'm really excited about your advocacy page though, because I think at the national level, we need to be better at having a kind of more participatory approach, which I know is kind of an ambition for your advocacy work. So I'm really interested to see how that go, and and the proposed special interest group. The only other thing I was going to mention was because it hasn't come up, which is, and well, Jillian touched on it then, but something else that we try to do is kind of learn from outside of the volunteering sector as well. And I feel like that's an important aspect of our advocacy work. So I sit on various networks beyond volunteering, you know, whether that's the ACOS National Policy Network, or we set up last year, the Community Council of Australia set up a policy network, which Volunteering Australia sit on. And I think that's just really helpful in, you know, understanding what might be other priorities beyond volunteering. Yeah, and I think, you know, I think we need to both, you know, really work on that wider set of relationships before volunteering. But as Jillian was saying, really, you know, build how we get input from the sector more and on a more ongoing basis, because, you know, the submission process is pretty clunky. And, you know, we put out calls for information in Volunteering Australia's newsletter, but again, it's a sort of, you know, fairly ad hoc clunky process. But if we can have more of an ongoing interactive process, I think that would be fantastic.
Fantastic. So I guess I'll call out to those online. Do you have any questions for Sue and Jillian? They can be about specific national priorities that are, or state priorities that are coming up, or just more about the kind of advocacy sausage process that I was talking about, and hopefully we've managed to demystify a little bit for you today. Any questions? I haven't seen any pop up in the chat just yet. So while I give you just a minute or two to do that, I'll note that our next few webinars will be coming online soon. In April, we'll be talking about volunteering in a health context, particularly given some of the challenges of COVID-19 and how that sector is looking to reinvigorate and rebuild volunteering specifically. But the May webinar is going to be looking at volunteer impact reporting, and it should be a particularly great session as well. So make sure you check out our website. Those details should be up in the next couple of days. I haven't seen any more questions, but we have an observation, but that it's, you know, reassuring to hear about the advocacy process, but also that obviously some of the challenges, to know that we're all fighting the same fight. So thanks for that comment. Look, you know, and that obviously some of the challenges that you might have mirrored at your organisation, whether it's getting staff to talk about volunteers as well as employees and volunteer, you know, as well as just employees as part of the workforce, that's actually mirrored on a national level. So sometimes it might be quite interesting to think about the advocacy challenges that you face internally and think about how they're replicated on a national and state stage, and how we do our best to continue raising them, and some of the strategies that you may be using are similar to some of the strategies that Jillian and Sue have raised today. So thank you all for being online, and please give me a call. Thank you all for being online, and I encourage you all to sign up to the next webinar. Thank you, Jillian and Sue, for your time and expertise today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks. I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks.